I can find the grubby little fingerprints of all the dead white men that invented science. And I can see how those dead white men who invented science had their views warped by their whiteness and their privilege. What we're really doing is we are making the interests and the biases of dead white males the thing that which we run our society by. It has a set of moral prescriptions built into it, or a built-in moral worldview. And what that theory, critical theory, seeks to do is to answer the question of why do we live in a horrible, patriarchal, oppressive society rather than in the utopian paradise of the neo-Marxist vision. And so it seeks to criticize all social phenomenon to figure out why our society is, on their view, oppressive and horrible and racist and sexist. Why is everything like that? Derrida has deconstructed our notion of language, deconstructed our idea of a sign, and shown all you have is words relating to other words. Words are not attached to objects. Words are not attached to concepts. Words just relate to other words. But what Derrida is doing with the language here is to remove the possibility of objective meaning and any objective point of reference.
Hi, Wokal.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Good to see you. I can kind of hear the echo in this room. I'm in a very large room. Right behind me is an old heater that used to probably have coal in it, or actually what they have here is they use wood chips for the entire monastery. I'm in a monastery in Austria called
That's very
Heiligenkreuz from the 11th century. It's an old place. Jordan's here writing his book. He's hopefully finishing his next book, so that's why we're here. And I'm talking to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Is it an old stone monastery?
It is an old stone monastery. When we're done, maybe I'll take you outside and give you
that'd be a nice place
a
to
look.
visit.
I'll show you outside afterwards.
I would love to see that. Are you guys are in Europe, I take it?
Yep, we're in Austria. And we're going to be doing a tour after he's done writing his book. So.
Okay. A European tour?
A European tour, yep.
That would be fun.
We're going to go to Romania and Bulgaria and Albania, Hungary, Norway, Portugal.
Wow, that would be... Oh, wow. You guys are just going to hit everywhere, eh?
It's going to be awesome. Greece. We're going to go to Greece twice, I think.
That'd be fun.
I met you backstage at one of our talks.
Mm-hmm.
What city were we in? Do you remember what city we were in?
It was Regina, Saskatchewan, which is where I live.
Oh, yeah. Regina, Saskatchewan. That's right. We're going back there, I think. Or we're going back to Saskatoon. I'm not sure we're going back to Regina. Anyway, maybe we'll see you again.
Yeah. I would love
But
that.
it was very nice to meet you. It was very nice to meet you. And you said that you could explain postmodernism to me. And I said, well, come on my podcast and explain it. And you said yes. So here we are. So I'm pretty thrilled about that. And I've been trying to learn what I can, but I don't know very much. So hopefully I can help other people learn by asking you some questions. Okay. So the first question I have is, really, what inspired you to become interested in postmodernism? Critical race theory, gender theory. How did you get started in your research?
When I finished high school, I studied at the Eston College in Eston, Saskatchewan, which is a tiny little college. It is accredited, but it is a tiny little college that is run by a Pentecostal denomination here in Canada. And when I went there, the thing that was kind of all the rage, you might say, amongst young Christians at that time, or the thing which was driving the conversation, or the hot new thing, was the emergent church. There are a lot of names that get associated with what was the emergent church. So you think of, or if you were to ask people who was involved in the emergent church, names you might hear might be Tony Jones, Rachel Held Evans, Brian McLaren, probably the most well-known person. I think Rob Bell might have been associated with it. Ironically enough, people like Nadia Bowles-Weber and Mark Driscoll would have been associated with it at the time, although for different reasons, and they ended up splitting their separate ways. But at the heart of the emergent church or the emergent movement, or the emergent conversation, as they like to call it, was a certain amount of postmodern thinking and postmodern philosophy. When I was in my early part of my degree at Eston, I got a degree in biblical studies. There was an awful lot of dialogue with these emergent church thinkers, what they thought, why they thought what they did, and so on and so forth. And as I read their writing, I got a feel for why some of it would have been popular. I actually think I have some here. So here's one, Adventures in Missing the Point. That's Brian McLaren and Tony Campolo. That was a quite a popular book. Do I have some others? Oh, I do. Here's another one, The Stories We Find Ourselves In, which is The Further Adventures of a New Kind of Christian. Actually, just sitting on my shelf over here. Here's another Brian McLaren, The Secret Message of Jesus.
So are these Christian books?
Yeah, those are Christian authors who are writing and who have, in ways either greater or smaller, accepted something like a postmodern understanding or a postmodern worldview. And that was kind of my, what would you call it, my introduction to postmodernism. That was the thing which kicked off my whole journey. I graduated, I got my degree on the wall, 2006. In 2006, I graduated. And after that, I decided I was going to go and I was going to study philosophy. Because at the time, I kind of wanted to be a philosopher or a Christian apologist or something like that. I loved working in the realm of ideas. I liked working in the realm of Christian thought. And so I thought, philosophy, what a great area to study in. And when I showed up, all the philosophy students and the philosophy professors said, look, postmodernism is dead, at least in philosophy. And what I came to learn is that while thinkers like Derrida and Foucault and Baudrillard had in the 60s and 70s written a lot of postmodern philosophy, that was popular in European continental, what's called continental philosophy, or European continental philosophy that is popular in Germany, France, that kind of not the Anglosphere, but basically continental philosophy focuses much more on phenomenology and experience, and analytic philosophy focuses much more on analysis and logic, is a quick and dirty way to explain it. And so these continental philosophers, focusing on experience and coming out of the continental tradition of Heidegger and Husserl and Hegel and that kind of stream of thought, were popular in Europe in the 60s and 70s, and some of that had migrated over in English departments and in departments of literature, but it really hadn't taken off in the Anglosphere, Britain, Canada, the United States, Australia. That sort of postmodern philosophy never really took off in analytic philosophy. So when I showed up at a Western university in Canada to study philosophy, they all said, look, postmodernism's dead. That's gone. That's dead. We do analytic philosophy. We do some continental philosophy still. We do deal with reason and experience and emotion and things like that. But postmodernism, we don't really, that's kind of gone. And then I would go, okay. And so I would walk myself down to the women's studies department or to the anthropology department or to the fine arts, and it was postmodernism was everywhere. They were postmoderning all over everything. And I said, this is not dead. This has just been picked up in areas outside of philosophy. And what I came to understand was basically what had happened is the postmodern philosophy that came out of, I would say, the continental tradition, particularly Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, those kind of thinkers, when it came over and it came across, it didn't come across into America and Canada and Britain via philosophy departments that were really teaching this stuff. It came across in the arts and in literature, and it was really picked up in literary criticism by people like, I don't want to give away too many names, but somebody like Geoffrey Bennington might be somebody, Nicholas Royal. might be another person that we could look at. Paul Fry might be somebody we'd think about. Avital Ronell might be somebody we'd think about. And these people are not.
And these are literary postmodernist authors.
Yeah, these are people who would do their work in literature more than they would be doing their work. Well, maybe Avital Ronell might, but these are people whose training and expertise would tend toward the literary, but are also doing postmodern philosophy in that. And so they're kind of blurring the lines a little bit, but their work is being spread and taken advantage of in English departments. It's in the arts that this is taking off.
Yeah. Yeah. And which university did it come to first in North America?
That's an interesting question. I believe that the first shot that was fired in North America, the first postmodern shot, would be Jacques Derrida, who was a postmodern thinker, giving a talk called Structure, Sign, and Play at Johns Hopkins University. I think it was 1967.
Okay.
And he comes across and he gives a talk about post-structuralism, and that really kicks off the post-structuralist move in the United States. And his postmodern philosophy was then picked up in literature departments. It was picked up by women's studies people. It was picked up by queer theorists. It was picked up by anthropologists and sociologists. Those kinds of people were really picking up his work, but it never took off.
Why do you think they picked up his work? Why do you think they picked it up? Why wasn't it nursing department? You know?
Okay. So to understand that, I think I need to grab a book. I think we need to do two things. I need to give a brief description of kind of what postmodernism does, very briefly what it's useful for. Then we could talk about why it was picked up.
Okay.
So to be extremely brief and just give us something, because we're going to come back to this later, I would imagine. But postmodernism basically calls into question the canons of, or the traditions of reason, logic, rationality, objective truth, objective morality. And in essence, what it does is it says, look, postmodernism, and it doesn't just do this, but this is one of the things that it does, says all of your ideas, concepts, all the books that you've written, all the sentences you've ever said, all the language you've ever communicated is constructed by human beings. All the ideas that you've had are constructed by human beings. All the facts were discovered or constructed by human beings. And therefore, all of the things that you say are true, all of the moral values you have, all of the concepts, ideas, all of the philosophies that you have, all the value sets and structures that you have, all of this is constructed by human beings, and all of those human beings have their own thoughts, ideas, dreams, interests, and biases and agendas. And so you go, okay. And the implication of that for the postmoderns is all of the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, standards, and values have the grubby little fingerprints of the people who came up with them. I can find the grubby little fingerprints of all the dead white men that invented science, and I can see how those dead white men who invented science had their views warped by their whiteness and their privilege, how those men had their own perspective and their own interests, and how their interests and biases warped what they believed. And then when we accept what those dead white males all said as truth, what we're really doing is we are making the interests and the biases of dead white males the thing that which we run our society by. That's essentially what they're doing with everything. So they think that all of our moral systems, they say, well, you have a certain moral system. Yeah, but that moral system was made by dead white males who are all heterosexual, and all of their biases and their self-interest is all built into that moral standard.
They were inspired. If you say, what were they inspired by? They would say,
oh, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. But let me just kind of finish off this one part, then we'll get back to the question that you asked about how it came in and why, and then that'll parlay us into that last question. And so what ends up happening is they say every view is just a view from a point. There is no objective viewpoint because every single person has their own views, their own experiences, their own biases, their own interests, their own agenda. And so nobody can give an objective account of anything. There is no objective truth. That's the move that gets made. We'll come back to that. What Searle says, John Searle is a, how would you describe it? He's an Enlightenment philosopher. And I wouldn't say, no, he's an analytic philosopher, which is coming out of the Enlightenment classical liberal tradition, or what he calls the Western rationalistic tradition, stretching all the way back to Plato. And what he thinks is that Searle believed that that the people who were attacking the Western rationalistic tradition were not doing so because they really thought, oh, there's something wrong here. He thinks they were doing it on the basis of a political agenda. So he says this. I have to confess, however, that I think there is a much deeper reason for the persistent appeal of all forms of anti-realism. Anti-realism is the idea that we can't get an objective account of the real world. And this has become obvious in the 20th century. It satisfies a basic urge to power. It just seems too disgusting somehow that we should have to be at the mercy of the real world. It seems too awful that a representation should have to be answerable to anything but us. And this is why people who hold contemporary versions of anti-realism and reject the correspondence theory of truth typically sneer at the opposing view. And so what he says, he'll say something else here, which I'd like to read, which I think, if I pull it up, it'll be good.
So because there's no objective truth, there's no sense.
Yeah, if there's no objective
talking to one another, because it's just an opinion.
Well, he's going to answer that. So he says here, this is the piece that I was looking for. He says, if the relation of the rest of the Western rationalistic tradition to the traditional ideals of the university is more or less obvious, the relation between the attacks on the Western rationalistic tradition and proposals for educational reform is much less obvious. It is simply a fact that in recent history, a rejection of the Western rationalistic tradition has gone hand in hand with the proposals for politically motivated changes in the curriculum. So what is the connection? I think the relationships are very complex, and I do not know of any simple answer to the question. But underlying all the complexity there is, I believe, a simple structure. Those who want to use the universities, especially the humanities, for leftist political transformation correctly perceive that the Western rationalistic tradition is an obstacle in their path. In spite of the variety, most of the challengers to the traditional conception of education correctly perceive that if they are forced to conduct academic life according to a set of rules determined by constraints of truth, objectivity, clarity, rationality, logic, and the existence of the real world, their task is made all the more difficult, perhaps impossible. For example, if you think that the purpose of teaching the history of the past is to achieve social and political transformation, then the traditional canons of historical scholarship, the canons of objectivity, evidence, close attention to the facts, and above all truth, can sometimes seem an unnecessary and oppressive regime that stands in the way of achieving more important social objectives. In my experience, at least, the present multiculturalist reformers of higher education did not come to a revised conception of education from a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition. Rather, they sought a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition that would justify a revised conception of education that they already found appealing. So what he's saying here is, remember how I said that postmodernism gets rid of all that objectivity, all of those objective standards of truth, objective standards of reason, objective standards of logic, objective standards of rigor? These people wanted a political transformation. They saw the grubby little fingerprints of all those dead white males all over the university and said, aha, the university has a hidden agenda. The biases and the self-interests of dead white men are what gave us the organizing structure and the organizing principles of the university. And thus, the university is really carrying out the political agenda of dead white men. But what we want, we, the political left, we want to use the universities for our own political transformation. The problem is, if you want to use, for example, the English department or the history department to do political transformation, reason, rationality, logic, truth, rigorous statements of the facts, not being able to just make your opinion the truth, not being able to just cherry pick facts that suit your side, that all stands in your way. And so what Searle is saying is that there's politically motivated subjectivism here. These people launched their attack on objectivity, reason, logic, rationality, morality, standards, because those people wanted to use the university as a vehicle for political transformation. And objective standards and objective truth stood in their way.
And so they politicized the university.
Correct. So they
politicized everything in the university, education.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That was in the 80s when I went to university in the 80s. That's what was happening there. There was no more. You couldn't. They didn't believe in competitiveness. Everything had to be cooperative games. So they didn't believe that anybody could win. Everybody won. That's when that all started. It was.
Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because that I would be interested to hear in how that works out. What do you like? Did they?
Well, I was taking kinesiology, which is really the philosophy of the body. So I take physiology, psychology, and the physics of the body. And we were, phys ed was the other side of kinesiology. So we were the science side of phys ed, really. And I had to take an education course in case I wanted to become a teacher, a phys ed teacher. Okay. So that was why I had to take this course. But the course was, we had to do some swimming. We had to do some orienteering in the wilderness. We had to do some activities, but then we had to take learning styles. And so they had learning styles at that time and I can't remember it that well because it's been so long now. It was in the 80s, but it was the most dry, boring course that you could imagine, because they weren't teaching you anything that you needed to become a teacher. It was as if they had complicated up how I was going to present material to someone to a student. They had all these styles that I could use to do that, and I don't remember what the styles were anymore, unfortunately. Yeah. But I tell you, it was just the same thing every day. It was if you went to this course, you didn't learn anything. All you learned was you either teach them in this manner A, or in this manner B, or in this manner C, or this manner D, or E, or F. Like they had lots of different learning styles that you would use, but they were quite meaningless. And I really didn't like that course. That course didn't resonate with, like you said, with objectivity and logic and reason. There was nothing like that in there. The physiology was still good. The physics was still good.
Yes.
The psychology was still good. But the education side of things was tainted by this postmodern ethos at the time.
I'm going to lay out a little bit of Derrida, and I'll lay out a little bit of Foucault so people can kind of see where that goes. I'll lay out a little bit of critical theory. But before I do that, I just want to say that it is in the fact what you're saying fits perfectly with the timeline, because it was in the 80s that Henry Giroux and Joe, I believe his last name is pronounced Kinklo or Kinchlow, were doing work bringing postmodernism and critical theory into the faculties of education. And Giroux, who was working with people like Ira Shore, has been very, very explicit about his use of Paulo Freire to do this. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian Marxist educator who, how would I put this, who argued that all education is political, that the goal of the educator is to create, it's a Portuguese word. Basically, it gets translated as conscientization, but what he means is to be conscious and aware of the political and social power dynamics that are going on in every aspect of education and indeed in society at large. What that idea often now gets called just critical consciousness, and Joe Kinklo has brought that out. But the idea of critical consciousness is, I am aware of how everything is impacted by power dynamics, by power relations, how indeed all social negotiation and all social relationships are mediated by, in some sense, by power and by.
Why do you think they brought critical into the vernacular, you know?
So if you actually go back, there was a thing called critical philosophy that was going on in continental philosophy. That was like Immanuel Kant's thing. And critical philosophy was criticizing the limits of knowledge. So that term, critical, dates back way before anyone. But Marx came in and talked about the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. But Marx wasn't, how do I put this? But Marx was doing a very different project than what Kant was doing. Marx was much more political and much more activist than anything that Kant was doing. And Kant was talking about criticism of the limits of knowledge and the limits of human understanding. That's what Kant was doing with his critical philosophy. That's not what Marx is doing. Marx is doing political criticism of the society at large. In 1937, Max Horkheimer, who was a neo-Marxist writing at the Frankfurt School, wrote a paper called Traditional and Critical Theory. And in that paper, he lays out the differences between a traditional theory and a critical theory. A traditional theory is something that describes the world as it is. So the theory of evolution or the theory of gravity attempt to describe the world as the world is. A critical theory has a normative ethical dimension to it. In other words, it has a set of moral prescriptions built into it, or a built-in moral worldview, or a built-in moral vision for society. And what that theory, critical theory, seeks to do is to answer the question of, why do we live in a horrible, patriarchal, oppressive society rather than in the utopian paradise of the neo-Marxist vision? That's essentially what it's doing. And so it seeks to criticize all social phenomenon to figure out why our society is, on their view, oppressive and horrible and racist and sexist. Why is everything like that? The entire society, so say the social justice activists, is shot through with racism and sexism. And critical theory says, let's try and take apart the society to understand why that is, using the presuppositions of the critical social justice ideology and worldview. So we can actually find an explanation of this, which is this is in a paper by Alison Bailey called Privilege Producing Epistemic Pushback, and she just explains the difference very, very clearly. She says, philosophers of education have long made the distinction between critical thinking and critical pedagogy. The critical thinking tradition is primarily concerned with epistemic adequacy. Epistemic is a word that means to do with knowledge or how knowledge is gotten. And so the critical thinking tradition is concerned primarily with epistemic adequacy just means that our ability to know things and the tools that we use to gain knowledge are up to snuff. She continues, to be critical is to show good judgment in recognizing when arguments are faulty, assertions lack evidence, truth claims appeal to unreliable sources, or concepts are sloppily crafted and applied. Okay? In this tradition, sloppy claims could be identified and fixed by learning to apply the tools of formal and informal logic correctly. Critical pedagogy begins from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Here, the critical learner is someone who is empowered and motivated to seek justice and emancipation. Critical pedagogy regards the claims that students make in response to social justice issues not as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequalities. It is its mission, critical pedagogy and critical theory, is to teach students ways of identifying and mapping how power shapes our understandings of the world. So, what critical theory does is it seeks to say, we're looking at things through the lens of power, who benefits, whose interests are served. It is not looking at truth. It is looking at power, interests, biases. And so there's two different definitions of the word critical. And I think a lot of times critical theory gets a pass from people because they think that critical theory has got to be related to critical thinking, and it's not. Does all of that make sense?
Well, what I'm thinking is I'm trying to think of how, if I'm in a schoolroom and I'm teaching, I'm going to be teaching English, math, science, all of the necessary skills for the education. But the way that I'm going to go about it is to offer explanations of what I'm bringing forward in terms of always a power dynamic.
Right.
Never just a scenario of someone doing what they can to bring more understanding to something. There's always going to be someone pitted against another.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah. Unbelievable.
So they also would come along with all this a revised mission for education. And so this dovetails nicely with that thing that I read from Searle. Searle says these people want to use the universities for political transformation. And that's exactly what the critical theorists want. They believe that the goal of the educator, the goal of the teacher, is to engage in political transformation. It is not to... The first and foremost goal is not something like making sure that the kids are as good at math as possible, or to make sure that the children are as excellent at understanding English literature as possible, or to make sure that they can grasp the ideas of biology as well as possible. Those are all secondary goals. The primary goal is political transformation of the students, to make the students critically aware, to make the students be able to see all of the power dynamics in the way that the neo-Marxists would understand those power dynamics to be functioning. In other words...
So just a sec. So say I'm in, say I'm in LA and I'm in a part of town that is more disadvantaged than others. And so there's more Black kids there. There's more immigrants and so the English teacher or the biology teacher or the teacher is going to be presenting the information so that the kids recognize that they are victims in this oppressive white society.
That's right.
And that they are disadvantaged.
Yeah.
And so then the learning is about, what would the learning be about? I wonder.
So, The idea is that you want to build, because they believe all knowledge is political anyway, is all just politics. So all of the biology isn't objective knowledge. Those are ideas that have been constructed by dead white males, and those ideas all have the grubby little fingerprints of the interests and biases and agendas and whatever else of all of those white males and their perspective and their yearning for power. So they would say that the goal of the teacher is, in whatever material the teacher is teaching, to make sure that the students are understanding the power dynamics involved in all of that literature. So that is ultimately their goal, and they do this in everything. Hijacking the topic, there's a book called Educating for Social Justice where a teacher named, her name is Lynn Lamisco, talks about how she trains teacher candidates, how she trains teachers to use lesson plans for teaching about social justice in everything from math to science to physics, everything. That's a revised conception of education, because that's what they care about. They think they would say that the goal, so when you talk about biology, if you wanted to teach biology, what you do is you would teach failed theories and then show how those failed theories were attempts by racists to keep those kids oppressed, and then say, and by the way, the new theories are just as racist and they're also keeping you oppressed. That might be something that you would do.
And I hear that they're going after math now. So
yes, yep, yes,
which is, I don't know what that argument is, but if 2 + 2 isn't 4, if you can convince somebody that it's other than 4, I don't. Do you know how that works? Have you looked into that?
I think this is probably a good spot, because what we've identified so far is that the social justice movement, the woke movement, critical social justice, if you want to call it, has 2 wings. There's the critical theory wing on the one side, and there's the postmodern wing on the other. We said a little bit about the postmodern wing, but then we got into the critical theory wing. And we talked about how critical theory wants to see everything through the lens of power dynamics, how critical theory wants to investigate all of society and ruthlessly criticize it for not living up to the neo-Marxist vision of society and how society should be. And so with that kind of set of ideas in play, what I'd like to do is say, okay, so we've got some of that critical theory down. We can see how that functions. You're criticizing everything. You're looking at every idea through the lens of this kind of neo-Marxist obsession with power dynamics and who benefit and who has interests. You're using every subject, math, physics, science. You can criticize everything in this way. You can criticize football games like this. You could have a critical theory of football that said, well, it's the men that get to be on the field and are the champion, and the women are standing on the sidelines, and that's a power dynamic because it makes men the star and it sidelines the women, and it trains women to see themselves as a sideshow to the men who are the main show, and that's sexist. You can do a critical theory of anything on the spot. You could do a critical theory of a bathtub. Well, how was the bathtub designed? Who was the bathtub designed for? When you make a bathtub, is it accessible to people in wheelchairs? Who were the inventors of the bathtub? Are the inventors of the bathtub white? Because they might have designed bathtubs that were made for white people. And so not everyone can afford a bathtub. The existence of the bathtub creates expectations that people bathe and shower, but people who can't afford bathtubs can't. So it creates a division between those who can afford to bathe and those who can't. And that creates racial divisions. So really, there's a certain racism that exists in the bathtub, because you could do this with everything. You could literally do it with everything. That's the critical theory. The problem is that critical theory keeps running into this little thing called reality. And that was part of the problem. And that's the thing that postmodernism goes after. So I think it might be a good idea to say a few things about what postmodernism is, and then show how postmodernism and critical theory kind of work together to get the the woke people where they want to go. Does that make sense? Is that a good idea?
That sounds good. Yep, I think that sounds like a good idea.
Postmodern philosophers are very, very verbose. They go on and on and on. And it is very complicated. So what do we do about this?
A lot of smoke and mirrors, huh?
I would say yes. I would say, how do I put this? A lot of the nonsense gets hidden behind jargon. There's a beautiful line in this book here. Let me see if I can, if I have it here. This book here, Mind, Language, and Society, Mind, Language, and Society, Philosophy in the Real World by John Searle, where he talks about, he makes this wonderful little line. He says, often, by the way, we can find out more of what is going on in culture by looking at undergraduate textbooks than by looking at the work of more prestigious thinkers. The textbooks are less clever at concealment. And so a lot of the really prestigious thinkers are engaged in a sort of concealing of what's going on. They're playing a little bit of a game of hide the ball. I don't know that it's entirely dishonest in terms of lying, but it's not being forthright with what their actual motivations and goals are. Okay? So there's a little bit of a problem there. And I'm stuttering trying to get that out because I don't want to accuse them of just lying because they're not. I think some of them are sincere. But they also do want to kind of play hide the ball with the postmodernism. So we're going to talk about two guys, Derrida and Foucault. We're going to restrict ourselves to them. And I'm going to go through a little bit of an explanation of what's going on with Derrida, and then an explanation of Foucault, and then we'll do a little explanation of Baudrillard, and then we'll have our postmodern world. So, this is what Derrida does. Derrida looks out at the world, and he sees this. He sees that most people think there's an object in the world, say a chair. I look at the chair, I see it, I form an idea in my head of the chair, and then I say the word chair. So we have three things there. We have the object in the world, the concept in my mind, and the word chair. The idea behind language had largely been something like words refer to concepts, and the concepts are in some way connected to the objects in the world. A pretty simple picture. You could do this with anything. Think of a tree. Okay, I go out, I see a tree. I get into my head the idea of a tree, and I say the word tree. You can do this with cars, trucks, the moon, the Battle of 1812, the anxiety of man living under capitalism, like any phenomenon. You would say, look, there's the thing, the object in the world, and then I have my idea, my conception of the object in my head, and then I say the word, and the word is connected to the concept, and the concept is connected. Seems pretty simple. So a guy named Saussure comes along, and Saussure does something like this. Saussure says, that's really not very good. Saussure says, that's not quite right. That isn't exactly what's going on. And you're going to go, oh, Saussure, because people think, well, why not, Saussure? And Saussure goes, well, here's a much better picture. Saussure says, look, Saussure says, what we actually have is something different. Saussure is going to argue that the systems of language are made up of signs. So what's a sign? A sign is made up of two parts. There's a signifier, so something like the word or the symbol, and then there's the signified. And the signified is the thing that the word is pointing to. So in our original view, the sign, let's say the word chair, gets its meaning by referring to something else. In this case, by referring to a chair. It gets its meaning, its value, its identity from what it refers to. When someone says, what does chair mean? The answer is going to be something like an object with four legs and a back upon which people sit and which is built by humans. Something like that. On this view, the solid object in the world we call a chair exists independent of me. I get the idea of a chair from running into one of it. The word chair gets attached to the thing by convention, and we just decide to call it a chair. Saussure says that the linguistic sign unites not a thing in a name, but a concept and a sound image. We might say a word and a meaning. This means we don't have an object attached to a word. We have a concept attached to a word. Remember in the old, I think, that the word chair refers to the chair, right? I look at the chair, I get a concept in my head, I say the word chair, and you know that I'm talking about that thing over there.
Right.
Okay? So, Saussure says that the linguistic sign unites not a thing in a name, but a concept and a sound. So, that's the signifier thing, right? We now have a word and a meaning. So he says, look, the words are not directly attached to objects in the world, but rather words are attached to a concept or a meaning. So words are not tethered to objects. They are the combination of the word and what he calls the sound image, but we'll just call it the word, attached to a concept or idea or a meaning. So what on earth anchors the sign? What holds the sign in place? What gives it its meaning? How does the sign get attached to a concept? And the way it does that is by the way it relates to other things. So I know that the word, for example, tree, I know what that word is because it's not free or three or see or truck or trap. I know the word tree. It gets its identity from its phonic elements, or in its written form from the letters that compose it, and the way that it relates to the other words.
It isn't because it's a tree and that the tree has roots and it's alive and it's sitting in the ground and it has leaves on it and it takes in the sun's rays. That has nothing to do with it.
So, well, he'll get there, because what he'll say is the word tree gets its identity, it gets held in place. It is identified or differentiated from other words by its phonic qualities and the fact that it's not free or C or B. And then the concept, it's a tree because of the way it relates to other words. So it's a tree because it's not a bush or a flower or a mountain or grass or moss. The tree is what it is because of the way it relates. So the idea of a tree is it's not a bush, it's not a flower, it relates to other words and other meanings. So it's kind of, the words are held in place by their relation to other words, right? No two words can just be swapped out. For example, I couldn't say on Saussure's view that I couldn't just swap the word tree and the word chair for no reason. No, they're held in place by the system of language. They have a place in the system of words. And the meanings have a role in the systems of meanings. So you could have a little diagram where you could have a little circle, and you could cut the circle in half, and on the top half it would say signified, and that would be the concept or the idea of a tree, and on the bottom half it would say signifier. And you identify a signifier by its phonic qualities and its spelling and the way it relates to other words. So I know the word signifier tree because I've heard that word before. I've heard you say tree before, and it sounds differently than free or bee or see or trap or truck. Okay, so I now have a signifier, tree. And then there's this...
So I get the signifier.
Yeah.
I get the signifier, but the concept...
The concept...
What about the concept?
The tree gets its meaning from the way it relates to other concepts. So on the level of the concept...
What kind of concepts?
So on the level of the concept...
What kind of concepts?
The tree is signified by relation to the concepts branch, bark, leaf, garden, wood, nature, etc., etc. And so it is the concept of the tree is held in place by the other concepts. So you could think of it like a dictionary, says Saussure. Look, when you go into a dictionary, it defines one concept in terms of other concepts, right? If I ask you the definition of what a tree is, you're going to say, well, it's those tall things that have bark and have leaves and have branches. And Saussure says, look what's happening here. It's the concept tree is defined as it relates to those other concepts like bark and branch and leaf. Okay? So are we following
Okay.
along? Okay. Derrida's going to take
Yep,
this just
I get that.
one step further. So we started with
see.
the kind of lock view where words get attached to object via convention. And we moved to the signified signifier where the word is attached to a concept and the concept is held in place by its relation to other concepts. Derrida is going to come in and he's going to just completely revolutionize things by going one step further. And this is the hard part, but once we get past this, it's actually smooth sailing. So with Locke, you don't know what a word is until you get shown a tree. You want to know what a tree is? Locke says he's going to point over that tree over there. Go, oh, okay, fair enough. For Saussure, if you don't know what a word means, you need to find what it signifies. You need to get a hold of the concept. But, says Derrida, how does that work? Suppose you don't know what a word means. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to look up in the dictionary. And what do you find? You find more words. Well, suppose you don't know what those means. What do? Well, you go and you look at more words. And you go find the definition of those words and find more words. So suppose you don't know what those mean. Well, you look up and he says, look, it's just words are defined by other words or defined by other words or defined by other words. There is no signified concept or idea or meanings that are just floating around in the world, says Derrida. All you ever have is the signifiers. There is no signified. If someone brings you a picture of a tree, that's a representation of a tree. It signifies a tree. If you point at any particular tree, that's just using the an actual tree as a signifier of the category of trees. No one could ever bring you the category of tree. I could bring you an individual tree, but I could never bring you the whole category, the signified. So there are no signifieds. All there are...
Because all trees are different? Is that why?
No.
Because all trees are different?
No.
No.
Well, that's part of it. But the part of what he's saying is that all the words are just defined by other words. There's no concept of a tree that's just floating around in the world. Because remember, Saussure said you have a word and you have a concept. And Derrida says, what concept? All you have is words attached to more words attached to more words.
And none of those words relate to, but certain words relate to other words.
That's right.
Yes?
And he thinks that all words get their meaning from the way they relate to other words, and that's it. There's no concepts floating around. It's just a system of words, all of the words relating to other words. All we have is...
And why does he say that?
We're going to get there in a second. All you have is a set of words that are related to and refer to other words, which themselves refer to other words, which refer to other words. And Derrida thinks that when you have enough of these words all relating to each other, meaning emerges like a mist would emerge, like a cloud would emerge.
Right. So if I had a tree, if all I had was a little bit of bark, I wouldn't have that. I wouldn't have a full idea of what a tree was.
Right. You wouldn't. And someone would say, well, it's that. And you'd say bark. And well, what would bark be? Well, it would have to relate to, the bark would relate to branches, and branches would relate to organic matter or plants or gardens. So what's happened here is Derrida has deconstructed our notion of language, deconstructed our idea of a sign, and shown all you have is words relating to other words. Words are not attached to objects. Words are not attached to concepts. Words just relate to other words. Okay. So that's the first move that he makes. The second move that he makes is to say, look, in our bad old tradition, writing refers to the graphic form of the phone, or it's a written form of the spoken. The spoken word is the present primary language, and written words are derivatives of spoken words. And what Derrida is going to do is attack that and say, look, there's no different. He says, written words all get their definitions and ideas from other written words. He says, what do spoken words get their meaning from? Other spoken words. Derrida says, look, the idea is that people think that when someone's talking, that the intentions of the person are right there, that the concepts that are attached to the words are right there in the person's head as they're speaking to you. But Derrida says, look, the words aren't connected to concepts. We got rid of that. So the idea here is that writing and speaking, in both cases, it's just signifiers referring to other signifiers, words referring to other words. And so, says Derrida, there's no reason why spoken language ought to be made more important than written language. So,
because they're the same.
Yeah, they function in exactly the same way. He says, we used to think that you would sit and listen to a person, and in that, while you were listening to that person, you were getting the concepts that were attached to their words. Derrida says, no, what you were really doing is seeing words that are relating to other words, and then you are building meaning from that through context and interpretation.
Okay.
It's all signifiers pointing at other signifiers.
You know, I think I learned this in my education class in the 80s.
Yep.
I think I did. Yeah.
What Derrida is going to end up saying here is all words are relating to other words, and that's how they get their meaning. There is no such thing as a concept or an intention which gives a word its meaning. It gets its meaning from the system of words. Now, he's going to do a little bit of trickery with this. And what he's going to do is he's going to say, it isn't just the words that are there, but also the words that aren't there which tell the story. So you could think of it like this. Suppose I go up onto the blackboard and I write the letter Z. How do you know it's a Z? Well, it's because it's part of the English alphabet, right?
Right.
Now, suppose I write the whole alphabet on the board and I say, what's on the board? You'll say it's the whole alphabet. Well, what's the difference between...
Right.
And Derrida's going to say, you know it's a Z when it's just a Z by itself. When the alphabet is absent. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the missing rest of the alphabet, all the A, B, C, D, all the way through Y that's missing, is what makes it a Z. Mm-hmm. Okay? So the fact that there's just a Z and nothing else is what makes it a Z. Okay? So it's this play of what's there and what isn't, what's absent and what's present, and how these things all relate to each other. But there's no concepts. There's no meanings. There's nothing inherent. There's no substances. There's no forms. There's no concepts. There's no definitions floating around which gives things their meaning. Now, this all sounds very silly. You go think of like, well, how is this gonna help us? So Derrida's going to take all of this and say, all of that you're doing when you're reading is looking at the letters that are there and aren't there, and the words that are there and aren't there, and you're seeing how all the words relate to each other. And then the meaning from that is you are constructing the meaning by interpreting it. You have a particular context, and it's context and interpretation. Well,
and so if you're a white man, you're going to you're going to bring that. Is that part of it? You're going to bring your who you are and what you've experienced as a white male.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are we doing when we read? Well, you might say we read a room. A quarterback can read a defense. I might have to read a situation. We might want to get a good read on the traffic. Somebody, when they're climbing a mountain, might want to do a read of the rock formation. When we read a passage, according to Derrida, we're looking at a systems of differences of how all the words differ from each other, and interpreting or reading using the differences between the words to identify, and then we read the meaning and get it through the interpretation. And Derrida says that whatever we do when we read a situation, read a room, get a read on that rock formation, is what we're doing with everything. Reading is the paradigmatic way in which we think about the world as it exists. The world takes on the world is like a book where we're reading the world. That's a hippo because it's not a rhinoceros or an elephant or a cat. That's a mountain because it's not a valley or a hill. We're reading the world in the same way that
Well,
we're
that's a
reading
very
book.
basic material view, huh? It's
Yes,
it's only material.
that's right.
Ugh.
Everything is read and understood in this way. And the word text encompasses to expand everything. The world is like a text for Derrida. The result here is that nothing has any inherent meaning at all. It isn't just that things are meaningless, it's that there's no inherent meaning. There's no linchpin. It's just a sea of flux of objects and words and everything else existing and differentiating themselves from each other, and we just read those differences and we interpret them in particular contexts. There's no God, no essences, no foundations, no substances. There's nothing on which the value, nature, or definition of anything rests. When he says there's nothing outside the text, that's what he means. He's saying how you understand a text by just looking at the words and reading those words as a system of words and understanding what those words mean through context and interpretation, that's what you're doing with everything else. Everything is like that. Thinking, you might say, proceeds by reading. And when you read, says Derrida, there's no inherent meanings in the text. All there is words relating to other words, and the meaning comes through our interpretation of those words. There's no inherent concepts. We got rid of that, right? Because we said, look, the words are defined by other words, and those words are defined by other words, and those words are defined by other words. Look, I can't find a concept or a meaning anywhere. All I find is words. And Derrida says, see, words defined by other words. Objects are defined by other objects. And how do you get the meaning of a tree? Well, the meaning of the tree as it relates to other words, and how those words are used by people to relate to the world. So it's all just a series, all of these words, writings, marks, signs, and objects are all just relating to each other. And what we are doing is purely interpretation within a particular context, and we build meaning.
So what if I climb the tree and then fall out of it? Does that change the situation?
Well, that would just add additional context.
Does it make it so that would give me a relationship to the tree?
That's right. You'd now be that would place you in a particular way of relating to the tree. And we know that you're not the tree, you're different from the tree. And we also know, well, you fell out of the tree, but the bird would not. The bird would fly, so you're not a bird. You're probably not a primate, because a primate would have easily climbed the tree. You're not a cat, because the cat could climb up and down the tree. You're not the tree because you fell out of it. It's just the way you relate to the tree and the way you differ from the tree. And within that context, we might ask, why were you climbing the tree? Maybe you were playing a game. We could interpret your climbing the tree and falling out of it in a number of different ways.
And that would be okay?
Yep. This is how
okay.
everything
so we
functions.
can play so we can still play games? Can we still play games with Derrida? Are there any games?
Wait, could you clarify the question a bit? When you say can we still play games, what do you mean?
When you play a game, you have to say it's between two people, they have to agree on the terms of the game in order to share in a story,
right.
Really. Because that's what a game is.
Yeah. So what Derrida is going to do with something like a game is he's going to say, he's going to deny he's a relativist. He's going to say, look, of course you could have rules. And people could agree on rules to the game. But those rules exist and have their meaning in a particular context under a particular interpretation. And Derrida is going to say there's no absolute objective way to interpret the rules. He's going to say, look, a pitch that one umpire thinks is a ball, another umpire thinks is a strike. Well, which is it? And Derrida says, it's whatever the umpire says it is. So he's going to deny that there's any clear, stable, objective meaning to the rules. What we can have is a lot of overlapping agreement, but there is going to be instability in all of language. Now,
That's how it feels. That's how it's, as you develop that, that's how it feels. It feels like an unmooring of stability.
that's exactly what he's doing. That's exactly what Derrida's doing. Because before, remember with our good old Lockean view at the start, we were pinning the names of objects to objects in the world. That seems pretty stable. Derrida's going to say, that's not right. And he's going to divorce language from the world in a certain way. Now, he's going to reattach it in a different way, but the way that he attaches it makes it completely unstable. Searle, my favorite philosopher, Searle, goes after Derrida ridiculously hard and talks about why he's wrong. But what I want, this is all super complicated, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners listened to that first half and were just like, there's a signifieds and signifiers, and what the heck are this guy doing? Yeah. Yes, it's technical.
Welcome to university.
Yeah. But what Derrida's doing with the language here is to pull the words and to how can I put this? To remove the possibility of objective meaning and an objective point of reference. So I like to use an example of a bucket to make it simple. So now that we've done through this really hard part of Derrida, which was very difficult and painful for everyone, let's use a little simple example so that everyone can catch up. Suppose I have a bucket on a construction site. It's one of those big 10-gallon pails, and there's 4 or 5 of them. And it's lunchtime, and we look around, and I pick up a bucket, I turn it upside down, and I sit on it, and I say, guys, pull up a chair. That bucket just became a chair. Now, was there any substance in the bucket? Was there a special energy of the bucket that came in? Was there a certain chairness? Like, did the bucketness flow out of the chair and then some, like the energy of chairness flow into the... No. So, but are buckets and chairs the same thing? Well, they can't be the same thing. So what makes the bucket a bucket and what stops it from being a chair? If I use it to carry water later, is it still a chair? What's going on here? And that sounds like a silly example. It's like, well, buckets and chairs are different things, but the bucket is a chair. Like, what's going on here? And Derrida's going to say, look, it's a bucket in a certain context when used a certain way, and it's a chair in a different context. You interpret that object as a bucket when you want to carry something, and as a chair when you want to sit on something. And he goes, see? We're just interpreting the world and then using words to try and explain ourselves, and other people are interpreting our words. So when I flip the bucket over and I say, grab a chair, the people who are listening at me look at me sitting on the bucket. They interpret my words and say, he means an upside down bucket is a chair. Okay, well, I can do that. And Derrida goes, see, look, we all communicated just fine. Derrida says there's no problem here. See, it's easy. And it's got some intuitive force. That's what Derrida's got up his sleeve. Okay?
Yes, because that does make sense.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it really looks like it's gonna go. Right? The problem that Derrida begins to run into is how do we undo Derrida in a really nice way? Derrida, if the words are all just relating to other words, how does your system get going? How do I know to interpret it one way instead of another? Derrida, you say there is no inherent, that things are just are identified by their differences, and that there's no inherent meanings, there's no inherent substances, there's no inherent form, there's nothing inherent to the object that makes it what it is. Okay, Derrida, how do the objects differ from each other? Because you say you judge an object by its differences. They differ in virtue of what, Derrida? By their inherent properties? Oh, Derrida, you've got a problem. Because your entire system of things are known by their way they compare to other things, but there's no inherent meanings to anything. There's no inherent substances. There's no inherent forms. There's no inherent definitions. There are inherent properties, Derrida. And it's those properties that are doing the work of allowing us to judge how things are different. That's what makes them different. that you've got these properties. The second thing that Searle does is say, hey, look, Derrida, you've got a problem. Because if the words don't have any meanings or any intentions attached to them, then I can make the words say whatever I want. And Derrida got quite upset at this, and Derrida says, well, you've misunderstood me. And Searle goes, wait, you keep complaining about being misunderstood. Does that mean that your work has objective meaning to it? There really is a thing that you're trying to say? That the words don't just mean whatever someone interprets them to mean? Uh-oh, Derrida, your system is beginning to shake. It's beginning to have little cracks pop up in it. We do use interpretation, and we are using context. But you know what else we use when people speak? The intent of the speaker. Language, says Searle, is about communication. And the fact that concepts might have fuzzy borders around them doesn't mean that there's no paradigm cases. Or to put it a little bit more carefully, the existence of unclear cases does not mean there are no clear cases. I'm not merely looking at a system of differences. There really are intentions, concepts, and ideas that are attached to words because we are conscious people, and conscious people work with ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and those are the things that we are communicating when we use language. So, contra Derrida, it is not the case that words get their meaning merely from other words and I interpret them. Words get their meaning in part by convention, what Searle calls collective intentionality. We assign meanings to words, and we communicate with each other by the way that we use those words.
By the way we use objects, too.
That's right.
Like, how we use an object defines what it is.
That's right, what Searle calls the function. Objects can have functions assigned to them. What's happening in my bucket chair example is that we're assigning a function to the object so it can be used in a particular way. So what Searle says is, look, Derrida, you've got this whole thing wrong. You've completely misunderstood what's going on. And Searle does a wonderful job in an essay called Literary Theory and Its Discontents of just eviscerating Derrida and saying, look, Derrida thinks that his system of differences is going to get him where he wants, but the system of differences is really parasitic on objective features of the world. So no, Derrida, you can't get your subjectivism. And then Derrida says the words are defined by other words, and Searle says, no, we use words to talk about other words, but he says we can also use other things, gestures, pointing, and all of that is undergirded by what? The things that are going on in my head. Namely, concepts, ideas, thoughts. The technical term in philosophy is intentionality, not just in the sense of intending.
Inspiration.
Yeah, it's all of the thoughts in my brain, my conscious thinking. And it's that the words are being used to communicate the ideas. So says Searle. But you can see
why would he want to deny himself of all of that and to simplify it so that there was there's no grounding in humanity in his thought?
Yeah.
Why would he do that?
And
crazy man.
Yeah, it is. Because you can see the difference in Searle. I'm connected to the world through my five senses. I then get conscious awareness of those things, and I use the words to communicate the conscious awareness to other people. And by convention, I can recognize their intentions because I can recognize my own. And so there's a thing going on of mutual recognition of ideas, and we build a language so that we can communicate our ideas to each other. Wow, what a great way to run a language. When you have Derrida, the intentions are gone. All you have is words, and then you're just looking at the way the words relate to other words, and you're building your own interpretation. Well, that's no way to run a language. Why is he doing that?
No, and it makes you feel stupid too to do that because you're not. I think because you're not relating to anything, and it makes you feel unmoored and uncomfortable.
Yes, it is unmoored because all of a sudden the words aren't attached. There's nothing to hold the meaning of the words in place.
Yeah.
Nothing holds anything in place. So I'm going to read just a bit of Searle here again. So here's his default assumptions. He says there's a real world that exists independently of us, independently of our experiences, our thoughts, or our language. We have direct perceptual access to the world through our senses. Words in our language, words like rabbit or tree, typically have reasonably clear meanings. Because of their meanings, they can be used to refer to and talk about real objects in the world. There. That's Searle's view.
Right.
Isn't that so much better?
Searle.
Way better.
Yeah, I don't know
much
of Searle.
Simpler.
I've never heard of Searle. I haven't read about him yet.
Yeah, he's an analytic philosopher. He was trained by J.L. Austin. He's got.
How long ago?
Now.
How long ago was he around? Oh, I see. He's still around.
1959 was when I believe he first started. His first major work was called Speech Acts, and that was written in 1969. His magnum opus on consciousness was written in 1986, I believe. It's called Intentionality. And Searle is, what Searle basically shows is that what people like Derrida are doing is nibbling around the edges of unclarity of the fog of certain words. Because your husband made a comment in a recent video that he said words. He said there's the core part of the concept, and then there's the fuzzy borders of a word. Searle actually explains that in his essay, and he says, look, he says, of course, he says, all interpretation and meaning occurs in a network of intentionality against a background. So he says, look, you have background capacities. You can see things, you can hear things, you can speak, you have a brain, you have cognitive faculties, you can reason, you can think, you have all these background capacities, right? He says, and then you have a background set of knowledge, which is roughly speaking something like, so that's the deep background, he says, those physical faculties that, I can touch things, I can smell things, right? And then I have the shallower background, which is all I know the language, I understand the cultural assumptions of my culture, things like that. He says that's your background. And he says you have a network of intentionality, which is basically all of the contents of your conscious awareness. And he says, hey, look, your conscious awareness gets interpreted against the background of your cultural knowledge and your cognitive faculties. So he says, I'm vastly oversimplifying his view here for the sake of brevity, but you can see what he means. And he says, because we have a network of intentionality, which is all of our conscious awareness, and we have a background of capacities, he says, there will always be some fuzziness at the edges of words. We don't have the sort of crystalline purity of concept that Derrida wants. But he says that doesn't mean that the words aren't held in place and don't have some objective meanings. It just means that there will be certain cases that are on the line. But, says Searle,
and there's always space between things, which is an unknown space, which you can call the fringe.
Yes.
And so that's part of realizing.
That's right.
The world in a physical way, but also in a concept way, or in a conscious way,
and
that we have understanding of each other. But it depends on negotiation between two people to bring that closer together, so that you can find out what each other means, more directly.
That's right. And what Searle says is, all of these people keep bringing up concepts that are on the line, right? Like when you say you have you see this all the time in the gender debates. Someone says a man is this or a woman is this, and someone brings up a case. Well, what about somebody who had genital cancer and had their genitals removed? Are they a man or a woman? And Searle's response to this is something like, the fact that you know to bring up cases that are on the line, and the fact that you know a particular case is on the line, proves that you know where the lines are.
That's good. Yeah.
And because you know where the lines are, you know that there is the core part of the concept, and that there will be cases that are on the edge, that are sitting, as it were, on the fringes. But, says Searle, that it does not follow from the fact that there are, how would you say, unclear cases, that there are no clear cases. One does not follow from the other.
That's for sure. That's for sure. And that goes back to realizing that you need a goal, a clear goal, which would be the middle. And around the fringes, it's going to be more uncertain. And so on your way to the goal, you might get caught up in the fringes now and then and lose your way. But if you have a goal, then you can get back to the center, and you need that center. Otherwise, you have nothing to aim for.
Right.
And then you're lost if you don't have that, because then you're just out in the fringes, which is where you don't want to spend a lot of time out there, because it's not a unity. It's a, it's an everything place. Well, I don't know. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was hard getting to this part, getting through all that postmodernism is.
It is a slog.
It's uncomfortable.
Yep.
It's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable conversation, and I hope that people can get through this conversation to get to the place where it's not uncomfortable anymore, because it's worthwhile going through that to realize that you don't need to go there, that there isn't anything there more than, even if they have a point to what they did in their philosophy, that's not all there is.
Yes. They take one little observation and they go off the rails of it so that they can get rid of the objective world, and then they can just run their critical theory and interpret everything through critical theory. Right? That's what that...
Yeah, right. And then turn it all into power, which is another simplification.
That's right.
In another direction.
Yeah. And so it is, they often use the term unsettle. They say we're trying to radically unsettle the tradition, or radically...
Oh yeah, that's exactly what it feels like.
Yep. And they're trying to
it's an unsettling,
erode
for sure.
the foundations, break apart the foundations, because they think they can get away with it. And so I hope it's always going through this is always a slog, and I still haven't perfected the perfect way to teach this quickly and accurately.
I thought we did pretty well.
Oh,
I thought we did pretty well.
I hope so.
And especially you had to talk to me, and you had to relate it to me. If you were doing it by yourself, maybe you could do it quicker, but you were trying to relate it to someone else, and that's harder.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Anyway, I appreciate you having me. I would love to do a thing where we can go through Foucault. Maybe we could do something constructive.
Okay, let's do that. I'd be happy to do this more than once, and so that we can get a full understanding of this, because our children are at stake here, and I want people to understand this.
Okay. I would love that.